Hi, my name is Christian Hyde. I'm the Managing Director of Risk 360, and this is our ISO 27001 Explained series, where we cover off on all 114 controls in the ISO 27001 framework. Today we're going to cover off on Control Objective 9.2 around user access management. So this is one of the more complicated control objectives, so we're going to spend a lot of time covering off on every control, what those controls mean, and then what the typical evidence and things that you might have to do to satisfy a certification audit. So on my screen today, on the left-hand side, you'll see that I have the ISO 27001 standard up. This is an overview of the 114 controls, and on the right-hand side, I have the ISO 27002 standard up that has the detailed implementation guidance for every control in the framework. I also have a lot of examples that we'll walk through. That way you'll know exactly what you might want to provide an auditor and how you might want to satisfy this control if you're building out your own program. So Control Objective 9.2 User Access Management has 6 controls. But like I said earlier, these are fairly complex controls, and there's many layers to each of these controls. So we'll cover off on each one of them so that you know what you're doing. So the first control is 9.2.1. It is around user registration and deregistration. And if you watched our previous ISO video around onboarding and offboarding, this is a continuation of that control. So when you're thinking about user registration, deregistration, this is how you provision users access, and then when they leave the company, how you deprovision access. So this is going to manifest itself in a couple ways. One way is probably an onboarding and offboarding checklist. So when an employee comes on board, you provide standard access, and then when the employee leaves the company, you deprovision that access. So some of the artifacts that you're going to provide an auditor might include, I'll show it here on my screen, an employee onboarding checklist and an employee offboarding checklist. And that might be in the form of an email from a hiring manager with a checklist to remove all of their access, or an offboarding checklist when that person leaves the company. You might consider ways to automate some of this deprovisioning. So for example, if you're using Active Directory, maybe when they're removed from the HR system, their accounts are already disabled. Maybe there's some automation around removal of access from SaaS applications, or if you have an identity and access management tool, you might be able to remove that access in a more systematic way. Or you might be going account by account, removing access one by one. But that's what this control is about. It's all about removal and provisioning of access. Now if we move on to Control 9.2, this is around user access provisioning. So again, this is just how do you go about provisioning access. And the key to that is there needs to be some logic around assigning individuals only the access that they need to do their job. So you, for example, if you're assigning administrative access, only a certain group of individuals are going to get access to that. If you're providing email access, maybe everybody in the whole company gets access to that. So the way this will manifest itself in the form of an audit artifact is the auditor is going to kind of spot check some of your systems and want to confirm with you that those access, the individuals who have access are appropriate based on your judgment, that no terminated users still have access, or that, for example, an administrative access that is not overly broad. So this is somewhat judgment-based, but you want to have some kind of documentation. Maybe it's a policy, or maybe it's kind of a role diagram describing who should have access to what and what's considered appropriate for your organization. Control 9.2.3 is management of privileged access rights. So I want to talk about this one a good bit, because privileged access really translates to something like administrative access. And when I'm thinking through administrative access, there's a lot of systems to consider. So the most logical place to start, if you're thinking about this in terms of layers, like we talked about in Control 9.1, is what about your network layer? So if you're using Active Directory, administrative access could be your administrators group, system administrators, network administrators, domain administrators, anything that is considered administrator. How do you access that? And then if you move down, you could think about database administrators, or maybe system administrators, or who has, like in the engineering team, who has access to source code orchestration tools, who has access to source code, administrative access to that stuff. So you're thinking about every layer when it comes to privileged access management. Network, databases, applications, SaaS applications, key business applications like your HR system and your accounting system. Think about all those layers. And what does appropriate privileged access look like at each layer, and how do you want to manage that? Then we get down to Control 9.2.4, which is around management of secret authentication information. So this is a very difficult control, because when you think about secrets management, that could be cryptographic keys, it could be service accounts, shared user accounts, things like that. So there's going to be many solutions that you might want to deploy to manage secrets. Some of the common ones is implementing something like LastPass or Password One, which is a password management tool to keep all of your organization's administrative accounts. So for example, if you have a shared social media account, or if you have a generic administrative account for administering certain systems, that might all need to go in the LastPass. Or if you have certain individuals in the business, like your head of IT, who holds the keys to the kingdom, maybe you want to store some of those privileged account credentials in LastPass. That way, if that person leaves the company or something happens and you have to get access to those key accounts, you have a place to go do that and manage those. Another thing to think about when you're thinking about management of secret authentication is management of cryptographic keys. So some systems, the way that you grant authentication is through a cryptographic key, not necessarily a credential. This is common in engineering to have SSH keys or something similar. So different tools like AWS has something called KMS, Key Management System. There's a tool called Thycotic if you want to manage cryptographic keys and secrets management. So depending on what layer you're looking at, whether it's a typical username and password that's privileged, or it's a cryptographic key or something else, there might be different solutions that you want to consider to manage those. So that would be part of your risk assessment and kind of your solution selection to manage secrets. The next control is around control 9.2.5, which is the review of user access rights. So once you've kind of figured out a strategy to manage privileged access, to manage different systems, to manage secrets, you're going to periodically review those accounts to make sure that no one was inadvertently granted access, or that maybe a terminated user doesn't still have access. So your approach here will be to inventory all of your key systems and decide on what frequency that you want to perform that user access review. User access reviews are typically performed quarterly, but sometimes they're performed semi-annually. I think quarterly is the best practice. And you want to have a process to, one, generate a list of all the users that have access to a given system. Two, provide that listing to someone who knows whether someone should have access or not. And then have a process that if they identify someone that is not appropriate, that is resolved timely. So an easy example might be you have the accounting department who has access, knowledge of who should have access to the accounting system, for example. But IT might be the one who's generating the user access list. So you'd want to generate that user access list, provide it to the head of accounting. The head of accounting would review the user access list to make sure that there's no users that should be removed, and then report that back to IT, where IT can then carry out that review by removing users or updating the list or so have you. And you'll want to do that for all of your key systems. So really the first step is deciding what systems you want to review and which systems are your key systems, and then doing that periodic user access review on those key systems. Some systems you might review less frequently than others. So if it's a moderately important system, maybe you only do that twice a year. But if it's a mission critical system where you can't tolerate any misprovisioning of access, maybe you want to do that quarterly or even monthly. So you'll have some decisions to make there, and you'll want to put a procedure together to describe how you want to manage user access reviews. And then the last control in this section is control 9.2.6, which is the removal or adjustment of access rights. And again, that's going to be removing access when a person no longer needs access. That could be because they're terminated. That could be because they've changed jobs. That could be because maybe you've just granted them temporary access to carry out their job for a week or so. But whatever that process is, whether it's submitting a ticket, whether it's an email kind of thing, you want to have a formal process where you're telling people how to adjust rights and on what frequency they should be adjusting access rights. So those are the 6 controls in user access management. As you can see, there's a lot to it. There's a lot of solutions that you're going to have to decide through. You're going to have to write a policy. You're going to have to decide which systems you care about, how you want to manage secrets, how you want to manage administrative access. You're going to have to come up with a user access review process, and then a user provisioning and deprovisioning process, all in these 6 controls. So this tends to be one of the most effort-intensive control objectives in the whole framework, but also one of the highest risk and one of the most important. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you like this series, you can continue watching it where we cover all 114 controls. You can also check us out at risk360.com if you have any questions on how to build out an ISO 27001 program. So thanks for watching.